Welcome back everyone to more NASCAR Heat 3 coverage here at Knee Pit Gaming. Today's setup video takes us back to the Xtreme Dirt Tour and Dirt Richmond. So we're not on the asphalt version this time, we are on the dirt version of Richmond, talking about the dirt late models. This is a very interesting track. This is another track a lot like Dirt Bristol for me, where I can easily run the car wide open, and it ends up being more like a restrictor plate track where I'm trying not to turn the wheel any more than I have to. We're going to be spending some time talking about the setup. We're going to be talking about the track, about lap times, all of that good stuff. So let's get to it. All right, before we get into discussion of the setup itself, let's start out with some discussion about, very quickly, the lap times and the track itself. So the lap times here for me, quicker laps are in the 20.5 range to 20.6. Race pace for me on a consistent basis is a little bit higher than that, 20.6s or 7s, somewhere in that range, just depending on the traffic and how much clean track I've got and that kind of thing. Now the track itself is, it can be a lot of fun to race on. It's a little bit boring for me to drive just lap after lap on, simply because it is too much like a restrictor plate track for me, where I'm trying not to turn the steering wheel, so it gets a little boring in that aspect. But whenever you're racing, it is quite a bit more fun. So this particular setup has allowed me to, on maximum difficulty AI, finish anywhere from the top 3 to the top 5, and I get a few victories here and there, just depending on the length of the race and, again, how things go for me in that particular race. The track itself, you can run easily on the apron through both of the corners. Feel free to use that apron. It does not upset my car at all when I'm going through there. In fact, sometimes it'll help it turn a little bit. So feel free to use the apron. It is certainly good to use that for passing opportunities, particularly on the slower lap traffic as you come around to lap them. So on to the setup itself. The shock settings, the 3.5 setup that I love for bump and rebound, it just seems to work for me. But as always, feel free to mess around with that to make it feel the way you want it to feel. Moving on to the weight settings, left side weight is maximized because we are on an oval. And then we get to something that I wanted to try a little different. Generally what I do when I go to different tracks is I have in mind 3 or 4 different styles of setups or types of setups that I want to try out. And what I mean by that is there are different combinations of front weight, wedge, springs, and track bar that I really like to try out. For some of those, I'll use a lot of front weight and wedge. Some of those I'll use very little. Same thing with the track bar. Some of those I will use very little track bar. Some of those I will use near the maximum, and so on with the springs. And in this case, I was able to make about 3 to 4 different types of setups that all run about the same speed, all run wide open. This is what I'm choosing to go with for release on the channel, simply because I feel like this is probably the easiest one to drive consistently. So the front weight at 48%, you can see that is the minimum. Same thing on the wedge, 45%, that is the minimum. And then I simply built around that. Left front spring is at 280 pounds. I really like using that to try to help the car turn as much as I can get out of the left front, that is. And then the right front at 160 pounds. You can see that's quite a bit of a split in the front springs, and that's just to help the car on the entry to the corner and make sure that we get through there nice and secure without being too tight or too loose. So if you feel like you're getting too tight on corner entry, then play around with that right front spring a little bit, maybe lower that a couple of notches and see if that helps. But if you're getting loose on corner entry, one of your options is to increase the right front spring. In the rear, I wanted to use a little bit lower rear spring package here to go along with the minimum amount I'm using on the front weight and wedge. So 160 pounds on the left rear, 200 pounds on the right rear. 40 pounds of rear spring split here seems to work really good, and also to keep the car stable, which is important in maintaining that speed and not getting too loose or too tight. Tire settings, 24, 25 pounds on the left side. You see I'm running a little bit more than that in the left rear, but you've got plenty of adjustability there. And then right sides at the maximum 30 pounds. Now, tire settings can be all over the board. I've had good luck using down toward the minimums and then up toward the maximum. So really, it's just a feel thing for the most part on these dirt tracks. Miscellaneous settings, I am maximizing camber on both the left front and the right front. And then front sway bars at 1.15. I have played around quite a bit with that with some different setups, sometimes using as high as 1.5 or so. And it works just fine. Just be careful about adjusting this too much because you get the front sway bar too low or disconnected altogether, and the car will get very unstable and very twitchy. If you get this number too high, up around the 1.4 or 1.5 without the other settings adjusted as well, then you're going to get the car really tight and the car will not want to turn at all. So that's where you can fine tune and really use that front sway bar to help you out based on the other settings you're using in the car. Track bar is actually fairly low for me on the dirt tracks. And again, that just goes back to the type of setup that I decided to go with here. 10 inches on both the left side and the right side. There is plenty of room for adjustability. I've used with this exact same setup as high as 12 and maybe even 13, and it was just fine. It just ended up being just a little bit looser and scrubbing off a little bit more speed than I wanted to in order to be consistent. So I lowered it down, and 10 inches seemed to be a good number, but there's plenty of adjustability there. Brake bias, I've had good luck anywhere from 45 to about 55, just depending on if you want to use the brakes. As I mentioned, you can easily run this track wide open. That part is not an issue, so you won't need the brakes to get around the track, but you might need to use them in traffic, or you can choose to simply lift off the throttle, whichever method you prefer. Sometimes it's easier to trail brake it a little bit, and the lower number you use on the brake bias, that'll help the car turn when you're on the brake. So again, a lot of adjustability there. Wheel lock, this is another area where I tried a lot of different numbers. 15 seemed to be a good number because it helped me to be consistent because it slowed down the steering. I also used up to the maximum on this. I've used 25, 30, all sorts of numbers here, and they all worked just fine. You just have to adjust your driving style to fit the car itself. Now, steering offset is at 0.05, and that is simply to offset some of the hard pull to the left that you're going to get on the straights from using a certain amount of front camber. So you play around with this number. The higher the number you get, the less it will pull to the left. But be careful, because if you get it too high on this number, the steering offset, then you can actually introduce a pull to the right in the car, and that is very disconcerting, particularly when you're preparing to turn left all the time. Moving on finally to the gear settings. Third and fourth gear mean absolutely nothing in these cars, as you only have 2 gears. So first gear at 2.0, second gear at 1.0. That seems to work just fine for me to get started at the beginning of the race. I'm quicker to get up to speed than the AI are, so that's why I leave it at those numbers. Rear end ratio is at 3.82, but there is a ton of adjustability here, just depending on how many RPMs you want to run. I've tested out with this very same setup anywhere up to 4.0 down to about 3.6s or so, I think, and was fine, within a tenth or so on all of those settings. So it really just depends on how many RPMs you want, which of course will affect the handling of the car. If one of the great ways to adjust a car, if you're having trouble with getting a little bit too loose in the car, then drop that rear end ratio a notch or two, and that can generally help tighten the car up because you're on the throttle all the time. So the fewer RPMs helps to tighten the car up. And then overall, if you're a little bit too tight, then within reason, move that rear end ratio up a notch or two and see if that loosens the car up, simply because you're turning more RPMs. You can work with that and see where you find that sweet spot of the RPMs. I don't like to wind the car completely out. That's why I backed off a little bit instead of running like a 4.0 or maybe even a little higher than that. But again, all of that is going to be to your own taste and how you want the car to feel to you. So hopefully you've enjoyed it. Maybe you can take some of these aspects of the setup and create your own Richmond Dirt setup. Thank you very much for joining me, and stay tuned as we will continue our support of NASCAR Heat 3.